Good afternoon. We're going to give everyone just a minute to join us, and then we will get started. All right. Well, thank you all for joining. Good afternoon. I'm Jenna Talbot, Senior Vice President at Whiteboard Advisors. I have the pleasure of working with the Strata Center for Consumer Insights. Thanks for joining us today. Today we're talking about our Public Viewpoints series, which is a weekly survey looking at the impact of COVID-19 on Americans' work and education. We're now on week 8, and so we're looking forward to having a discussion here today. This week, we're focusing especially on the questions related to COVID's impact on education and kind of the disruption that the pandemic has caused on people's plans, or even created new opportunities for them to go back to education. So today we've got a great panel. We'll hear first from Dave Clayton and Nicole Torpey-Sabo from the center, and then we'll have a discussion with Jeff Salingo, former Chronicle of Higher Education editor and author, Kai Druckmeyer, who's the president and founder of Inside Track, and Mary Ellen Wiederwall, who's the chief of Louisville Forward. So really excited to join you all. We've got a packed conversation, so we'll jump right in. Dave, I'll hand it over to you. I think most of you who have joined us know we'll go through the presentation, have a short conversation with our panelists, and open it up for question and answers. You can certainly type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom. So please start to add those questions and we'll definitely get to those quickly. So Dave, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jenna, and thank you again, Jeff and Kai and Mary Ellen. And thanks to those of you who are participating with us, again, recognizing your interest in helping our fellow citizens and community members weather this storm and navigate it and move through it, and the critical role that education training has always played in social mobility and survival and employment and moving forward. So we're grateful to have this discussion today. Just as a reminder to level set, this is a weekly survey of 1,000 Americans that is representative by age and sex, by race and ethnicity, by level of education, and by 9 geographic census regions. It's intended to provide a touch point and early indicators of sentiments. So it's not forecasting enrollment for the fall, but it is talking about how people are feeling about their security in their work, their feelings about the need for education, the role it would play in their lives, their intentionality cast broadly. And so this attitudinal data, along with a little behavioral change, helps all of us understand these currents of change in unprecedented times. We'll continue this weekly cadence for 2 more weeks. We're now 8 weeks in, and then we'll continue to monitor through the fall at least over the coming 5 months. So thank you for joining us. We know the unprecedented changes that we've seen, and some of the numbers you'll see that Nicole will brief you on later are unprecedented. When you think of the magnitude, we know how many jobs are out there, and we know how many have been lost with these statistics. But also we see the sentiments people have just at remarkable levels that are hard to fathom in many ways. Some of those are that 52%, and this has remained fairly stable over the last 2 months, have lost a job or hours at work or a shift or income from work if they've taken a reduction in pay. 63%, almost 2/3 of those who remain employed are worried at some level that they will lose the job they currently have. And then 1/3 of Americans say, if I need to replace a job, I'm going to need more education or training to find a comparable job, one that has the same earning power in my life. So in that context, those have been stable across the last 2 months. One number that has changed has been this reality setting in. This is not something for 2 weeks or 3 months. Again, you just look at that change over time. Nearly half of Americans, compared to 30% as this started unfolding, saying this is going to be with us 6 months, 12 months, more than a year, compared to where we were 2 months ago. And so in that moment, we felt like it's now people are better situated and a little firmer as they're looking beyond the immediate shock and disruption to what am I going to do? How am I going to navigate? And that'll be the focus Nicole will help us walk through today with our reports as people are contemplating their next steps and their plans with regard to education. In past weeks, and this is all available on the website, but just a little bit of context around education. The overall interest on a 5-year horizon in pursuing more education or training has not changed from this time a year ago. So we've not yet seen a rush and a measurable intentionality that I'm going to enroll. What has changed is the degree to which people are looking toward employers. 10% less likely to expect education or training programs through employers than they were a year ago. Online education remains a top preference for modality for that education and training. And most adults who are thinking about the next 6 months are saying, I need something specific, a license, a certification, a few targeted courses to develop skills or pursue an interest, rather than the degree program enrollment. And so that immediate quick turn, Mary Ellen, I think will help us understand that. She's on the front lines with some of her work in Louisville. And then as you think about enrolling, there's a third, upskill. I need skills to advance and remain in the career field I'm in. A third saying, if I need education, I need to replace a job, I'm looking to change my field. And a third saying, well, I would do it because there's something I'm interested in, less instrumental or functional in their lives. So key questions Nicole will help us walk through is, how are those plans changing? How have they been changed? Where and when? Expectations around enrollment. Where do you look for valuable advice? If you rank order the different places you could get advice from, who's at the top and most relevant as we think about how to engage people in making decisions that will benefit them and have the desired return in their lives. And then differences that we see, some surprising, and we'll discuss those about age groups and prior education levels in those forecasts. I'll just quickly highlight, Nicole will come through these in detail, so we don't need to fully absorb them, but really a third of adults have canceled or changed an education plan in the last 2 months. And that's 65, 2/3 of the youngest adults, ages 18 to 24. So we'll really want to understand what that is and what's happening. While young adults are the most likely to have plans, and so by volume, they're most likely to have changes. The changes for adults ages 25 to 44 are most likely to be a complete separation from education. They're not reducing a course load or changing a school or changing a major or field. They're delaying or canceling or postponing completely those education opportunities. Interestingly, when we look at intentionality to enroll or pursue more programs or training, cast-wide, this is work-based training as well as enrollment in formal degree programs or skill pieces. Those adults ages 25 to 44 are just as likely as the traditional student age to say, I'll be enrolling in something over the next 6 months. We do see this phenomenon that we sometimes shake our heads about, that it can feel like it takes a college degree to get a college degree. Individuals who have already completed a degree are most likely to say, I'm going to go pursue additional education and training. And then when it comes to advice, families about whether to pursue training or not, families are the top ranked choice. So with that preview, let me turn it over to Nicole, who will walk us through the play-by-play on these. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave. So as Dave mentioned, we're going to be going through those 3 parts of this webinar. First, talking about how people's plans have been disrupted, then talking about people who are looking to enroll in the future, and finally talking about the advice that people would look for if they're trying to make sense of this education landscape and where they would turn. So first of all, talking about people who have canceled or changed plans. And so as Dave pointed out, we're talking about intentions here. So not necessarily people who are already enrolled dropping out, but people who had plans and how have those changed due to COVID. So overall, we see when we're looking at Americans 18 to 64, about a third of them are saying that due to coronavirus, they've either canceled their education plans or they've changed them in some way. So we reported on this a few weeks ago, and this kind of broad top line made us wonder, well, what's really underneath? If people are saying they've changed their plans, what does that look like in detail? So what we're going to go to next is, you see that, okay, we're looking specifically at people who were in one of those categories, that they either canceled or they changed something. So you can see canceled is still the most likely type of change, but then when you look underneath at some of these other changes, people are most likely to say that they've delayed their enrollment, or they've reduced the number of courses or the amount of training that they're in, followed by changing schools or majors, and then a few people saying that because of COVID, they've decided to start something new, which is what we'll look at in the second part. So underneath this, we wanted to look in more detail at age groups, because we know that education choices can look really different when you're in that 18 to 24 age group versus older adults, what those trade-offs are. So as Dave mentioned, these changes are much more widespread among the youngest group, simply because they were more likely to have some kind of plan in the first place. And so, you know, all this disruption is hitting about 2/3 of Americans in that youngest age group. But we see even for the 25 to 44-year-olds that we have about 40% saying that they have changed or canceled some kind of education plan due to COVID. So then when we, again, look underneath that, and once again, this is just looking at those who've had some kind of a change. So ignoring that group that said, this doesn't apply to me, I didn't make any changes, but really looking at the people who made a change, we see that older Americans are more likely to have kind of a bigger, more drastic change. So if you look at those green bars, you can see that on the top, they're more likely, those who've made a change, to have canceled altogether or to have delayed their enrollment altogether compared to those who are younger. So that's something that, you know, we really need to understand more, how this is hitting that older age group as well as just the traditional age student. So then next, we also wanted to understand more about how this might be different depending on the education that someone already has. And surprisingly, we see that it's actually pretty similar in terms of change of plans between people who already have a post-secondary degree or credential versus people who don't. Where we start to see a little more nuance, again, is when we look at the types of changes, which will be on the following slide. And this is actually more consistent than the age groups. It's pretty similar, the types of changes that we're seeing. But the one thing that I think is notable is down there at the very bottom, when we look at people who say, well, because of COVID-19, I've decided to start something new. I've decided to enroll in some kind of new program. That's where we're seeing more people with post-secondary degrees or credentials. And that's really what the next section is going to dig deeper into when we're talking about future enrollment. So this section is really focused not on people who are already enrolled, but people who weren't in any kind of education or training program, and now they might be thinking of it. You know, in previous weeks, we've talked about people saying that if they were to lose their job, they would need more education. And you know, we know that oftentimes in recession, people may turn in greater numbers to education. And we wanted to understand if that's the case here. So we asked people who weren't currently enrolled if they're planning on getting some kind of education, whether it be in a traditional program or employer-based or online, and what time frame they're looking at enrolling. And so this is just kind of the broad overview. We still see within the next 6 months, about 25% of all of our survey respondents say that they're likely to enroll in something. And then beyond that, we wanted to know what are the types of programs that people are considering enrolling in. So here we see, we've kind of broken these down into the different types. You see those blue bars are the online education, and those are the programs people are saying they're most likely to enroll in within the next 6 months. Then the green ones are employer-based, so employers or apprenticeships or internships are the next most popular choice for people who are looking for something new within the next 6 months. And then finally, you see those more traditional community college, trade schools, and four-year colleges and universities, and how many people are looking to enroll there within the next 6 months who are not currently enrolled. So following this, we wanted to do the same thing that we did before with looking at various age groups. This is what we found really interesting was here that you see that 18 to 24-year-olds and 25 to 44-year-olds really on the same path over the next 6 months. So if you're thinking about people who are not currently enrolled, who's likely to enroll in some kind of education, and here you see it's pretty similar across those two age groups. It's not just that youngest group that's most likely until you start looking a little bit further out. So when you get to a year, 2 years, 5 years, that's when the youngest group says they're more likely. But in the short term, this seems to be kind of affecting people so that that older age group is just as likely to enroll in some kind of education in the short term right now. So then breaking it down by the types, again, here's where we see differences in the types of education that they're looking to pursue. So way down at the bottom is where you see the four-year college or university. And you see that's pretty much equal between people in the 18 to 24-year-old group or the 25 to 44-year-old group. So there's about equal likelihood of enrolling in the next 6 months for that type of education. But then for all these other types, the online, the employer-based, and then trade schools, that's where you see that 25 to 44-year-olds are saying, there's more of them saying that they will enroll in one of these types of education within the next 6 months. So it's kind of a need to broaden our understanding when we're speaking about education and training and what that means, that it's not always just the paradigm of that four-year college, that there's lots of different ways that people are thinking about upskilling and reskilling and getting more education. Then we looked at it again by education level, and this is kind of back to what Dave mentioned about people who already have degrees are more likely to go back to school. They've had education work for them in the past. They've had some kind of successful experience, and so they're more likely to enroll in the past. Whereas for that group that doesn't have a post-secondary education, they're less likely to enroll at all of these different timeframes. And when you look at the types of education that people are considering, again, you see at every type, it's people who already have degrees. Those green bars are greater than people who don't have degrees. And so every different type of education and training, we're seeing people who already have the education saying that they're more likely to get more. Community colleges is the closest there, down at the bottom where you see the least difference between people who have degrees and who don't. But overall, we see people with degrees being more likely at every instance. Okay, so lastly, we wanted to understand more about people who said that they were going to enroll. So that group that we've been looking at and considering, people who said that they're likely to enroll in some kind of education, who would they look to for advice when they're trying to navigate this system? Who are they going to ask for advice? So we asked people to rank different sources of advice that they would go to when it comes to education or training. And here we see that family members are ranked as the most valuable source of advice. This is a percent of people who ranked family as number 1. All these are how many people rank them as the top choice. And then followed by information from colleges or universities or community colleges, employers, people who search for themselves on the internet, and churches, and government and community organizations. So then again, we wanted to understand this broken down by age groups and by people with different levels of education. So here the big distinction, I think we still see family at the top across both age groups, but we see that the younger demographics are relying more on information directly from those education providers, from the colleges or the community colleges. They're trying to go directly there for advice on their education and training, whereas older adults are doing a little bit more through the internet and some other sources. And then when we look at people based on whether they already have a degree or not, again, people with no degree are relying more on information directly from the colleges. Family is still top for both groups. That's the #1 source of advice, but people without degrees are looking more to the colleges, and people who already have degrees are looking at some of these other sources, like searching for information themselves online. So overall, these are the same key findings we revisited. We see that about 1/3 of Americans say that they've canceled or changed their education plans, and it's even higher among younger Americans who had education plans in greater numbers to begin with. It's more the stage of life they're in, so it's been affecting them. But secondly, we do see that for people who had plans, that were altered, that older group is more likely to have some kind of a drastic change. So they're canceling altogether, they're delaying. It's not a minor change, it's something pretty substantial. And we also see that that older group that's not enrolled is just as likely as the younger group to say that they would start something new in the next 6 months. Fourth, we see that people who already have degrees are more likely to enroll at every level in every time frame. And finally, that family are the most valued source of advice about education and training, and that there's some differences based on age and education level in terms of other sources of advice. So Dave, I think, was going to take us next to our panel with some questions for discussion, and then we'll open it up to all of you.
Thank you, Nicole. And again, thanks to those of you who are sharing questions through the Q&A and through the chat. We actually download those and categorize them and sort them every week. And it's really informed both the analyses that we've been reporting on as well as new questions that we've been adding. So thank you for those questions, even if we don't talk to everyone as we go along. They have been valuable. And one of those persistent themes that has been so helpful to have panelists join with us is, what does this mean? How do I act on it? What do I do with it? And so we're grateful again to Jeff and Mary Ellen and Kai. I think this notion of, those who have not previously completed post-secondary education and with lower likelihood to say, I'm going to enroll and engage, and the reliance on different sources and pathways in, how do we engage, if we think about job loss and economic development and workforce, what are the things we need to do to be attuned to and meet that group of our peers and neighbors where they are? I think Mary Ellen in particular will have thoughts from the front lines on the workforce system, both in a specific program, but more broadly, the principles that really can inform and shape us as we respond to this across the nation. And then for higher education providers, looking at this mix of, there's both opening doors and social distancing and all kinds of things we need to navigate, but about people who are coming to us, what are they seeking, and how do we adapt and meet those needs? And so just again, responding to your interest as a field of, how do we use this? What do we do? We've been grateful to invite this group of experts and leaders from our nation to talk to us today and talk with us. So Jenna, I think you'll help us moderate and navigate these questions. And we, again, appreciate all of you for participating.
Great. Thanks, Dave and Nicole. Yeah, so let's jump in. Just a reminder, you can ask questions in the Q&A section. So we will get to those very quickly here. Of course, we'd love if you share your name and affiliation. We've had just such a great group joining us every week. It'd be great to know who's asking the questions. Of course, if you'd rather ask them anonymously, that's fine too. But if you'd like to, pop your name and title in there when you share your questions. But let's start, Jeff, with you. So we're seeing, among traditional age students, we're seeing much higher percentages of students who are canceling or changing their plans. You've just wrapped up a book on college admissions, albeit pre-COVID, but you've been spending a lot of time talking to students and their parents. I'd love to know how this is playing out on the ground, And then also, what can or should institutions be doing to keep those students connected to higher education?
Thanks, Jenna, and it's great to be here with everybody, and I hope everyone is staying safe and staying strong in this period. I think we're in a period of great flux right now. I pointed out in my newsletter last week that we've had this term in higher education called the swirling students, and we used to think of swirling in higher education as students who would transfer from multiple institutions throughout their career. This is a term that's been around for decades in higher education. I think that swirl now is happening right now in this summer. And it will be very interesting as we move forward, as Strada moves forward in its research, to see the changes from week to week. Because I think that as we find out what the fall is really going to look like, especially for those students who may have just changed their education plans, maybe even canceled them, we might see them come back. We might see them change again. We might see people who've changed cancel. We might see people who haven't canceled cancel, right? So I just think we are in a period of flux right now. We have no idea what the fall is going to look like. We've heard, everybody went online in a couple weeks to remote education. And now we're seeing so many different scenarios play out for the fall. And until those become much clearer, and I don't think that will be really until August, will we know kind of what the fall is going to look like and what the cancel plans will look like. Now, that said, what should colleges do? What should institutions do? It's clear to me that kind of the traditional 4-year degree from your research is kind of out of favor right now, right? It's expensive for people who don't really know if they're going to have a job next week, if they're going to have childcare in a couple of months. I think it's really hard for people at all ages to plan now. Traditional 18 to 22-year-olds who may depend on their parents for finances or need to help provide for the family, but even among older students. So what I really think colleges should really focus on are two things. One is the transfer pathways, because I think community colleges and 2-year institutions in general are going to become much bigger and broader in this period ahead of us. So what are the transfer pathways? Because I don't think they've been very good in this country for quite some time. And then what other types of products as an institution can you offer to really appeal to those students? So we saw in the survey, these non-credit short certificates that I think are going to be really popular both at the undergraduate and graduate level. And I don't think most institutions are thinking that way. They're continuing to think, how do we get more students to take advantage of our traditional legacy products, which tend to be long, residential, and expensive. And I think we have to think away from all 3 of those things. Less expensive, less residential, and shorter.
Well, that's a good segue to talk to you, Mary Ellen, because you're talking about shorter. So in Louisville, you've been working with a number of training providers and with local governments and thinking about how we get shorter term programs in front of folks more quickly. I'm curious, in particular, looking at some of these findings, we're finding that those who already have degrees are most likely to enroll in the next 6 months. I'm curious if that's consistent with what you're seeing in Louisville. And then if so, how do you motivate folks who might benefit from further education, but that's not kind of their natural instinct as they're looking about a path forward?
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. We have a recent storied history with the pursuit of more post-secondary education. Over a decade ago, our community launched a collective impact model to improve the number of 2- and 4-year degree completers in our community. We set the goal to reach the 50th percentile, and while we haven't gotten there yet, we have surpassed the national average with 2- and 4-year degrees. But that story has changed in the last 5 to 7 years to be a more diverse story, a more complicated story, because much as what we're finding here in this most recent research has been an evolution to that point over the last several years as college education got more expensive and as the job market improved and people could find good employment maybe without a degree. So we've been focused on credentials, badges, and other non-degree programs as part of our post-secondary journey here in Louisville. About 5 years ago, we launched a very successful coding program called Code Louisville, and we've now had several outgrowths from that. And from that strong foundation, last year in partnership with Microsoft, we launched a program we call Future of Work. The Future of Work initiative is focused around, just like it says, but with a heavy focus on AI, IoT, and data science. And so this group was already up and running and working towards some goals for calendar 2020 when the pandemic hit. And they quickly transitioned and said, wow, we were already going to be focused on training and upskilling. We're going to double down. And so with this new initiative and training partners like General Assembly, our local universities, colleges, and the program that we started through Code Louisville and its spinoffs, we launched a new upskilling initiative a couple weeks after the pandemic hit. We have all of these folks who are either temporarily or possibly long-term unemployed. They're at home. They're now at home with their kids in many cases. And everybody's learning online now. Mother, father, and kids are all going back to school. When we launched this, I don't know that we had a great idea of what the outcome would be, but a few weeks ago, we threw this out and we said, here's all the free content that's available to you in Louisville. Go to this website, sign up here, tell us you're interested. We have now had 7,000 people, well over 10% of our entire regional workforce, respond to this call and say, I'm interested in learning more. And a couple thousand have already progressed into programs to work on new badges and credentials. And about 700 folks have already completed one or more credentials. So it's really impressive how quickly people latched onto this opportunity and ran with it. Some of the other heartening statistics behind this, we're talking here about how folks who already have a college degree are more likely to go back for education. Of course, they're comfortable. They know what college is like. They were good at it once, let's be good at it again. What's great about a large number of our completers, so of the people who have signed up for new badges and credentials and actually completed something, 30% of them do not have a college degree. So this is really encouraging, something we were working on before the pandemic hit. But it's neat to see we've got some different people accessing educational services. The demographics are also really encouraging. So this is all tech training we're talking about. 57% are female. That's huge in the tech space, and 10% identify as minority. So this is really an opportunity to give people a pathway to a new career, to upskill into something that's going to be valuable to them for a long time, and also to diversify our tech workforce.
Great, thank you. And we'll come back to more on that, I'm sure, in a minute here. Kai, so your work is focused really on keeping students in college and supporting their pathway to graduation. You're working across both traditional and non-traditional age groups and student backgrounds. You know, as we're seeing large numbers of learners, especially younger adults, canceling those plans, what should institutions be doing to stay connected to their students and ensuring that they do re-engage? You know, I'd be curious too if this is changing how the coaching team at Inside Track is even thinking about how they support their institutions and their students.
Yeah. Well, as far as the first part of your question, what can institutions do to stay connected to students and ensure they re-engage? I think now, you know, more than ever is the time to make sure your teams are well equipped, have the training and tools they need to effectively support students remotely. And my gut, just from talking with various clients, that the continuing education or online focused divisions have had to step up and provide support to the broader faculty teams and support services. That's not a one-time thing. That's definitely worth revisiting and continuing to improve and actually to check in on. And as you can imagine, when someone says online learning, it's not one experience. It can be outstanding or very poor. And I imagine there are places right now where if that were, people were checking in, they'd find there's an opportunity to improve. So getting folks to engage effectively remotely when they're used to face-to-face, that's number one. Number two, student-facing staff should at least get some minimal basic training in trauma-informed communication. All of the serious issues that students may have to deal with in normal times, those are heightened and they're more common. And so coming into any discussion, we have to be prepared to address those and be as supportive as possible, and then be aware of the resources you can get students to. Once those things have been addressed, and that's not an easy thing, but we do need to move students back to their core motivation for pursuing a degree and to get them back on track. Where is their life going long term, and have that discussion. Last piece I'll say, which is kind of a couple of cultural shifts. One is getting everyone to realize that everyone now is part of the student support team, and everyone has got to be focused on enrollment management. We're feeling it, we're seeing it ahead of time, but no doubt if all of the data you're collecting bears out and institutions have 15 to 25% fewer students, that's going to be a real serious issue for us. And so institutions have to be thinking now about creating pathways to keep their students engaged. In terms of the last part of your question of how are we doing things differently, we noticed, so everyone knows, our coaching is focused on improving student well-being and academic performance so that they're able to stay in college and finish in 4 years or 4.5 or 5 years or 2 years for an associate's. And that's still the focus. However, when students have acute challenges they're dealing with that are beyond the scope of coaching, we bring in crisis support services, which is something we've developed over the last 10 years. And we saw a serious spike in the need for that in March and April. That has calmed down a little bit, but I think as we see the echoes of the economic impact in the coming months and in the fall, that will rise up again. We are now launching emergency coaching to address these specific issues and equip more of our coaches to deal with that sort of crisis support. One other thing we're realizing, there's a real need for forums for leadership and faculty to talk about how they're doing. I think we've seen a change where, and I'm proud of higher ed for this, but there was such an emphasis on student well-being and taking care of students. That's all anyone wanted to talk about for the first couple months, and that's good. That's still a concern. Now there's been a move to enrollment management and, frankly, institutional survival in the fall. And we're just getting to the point of everyone, campus personnel, faculty, administration, and staff realizing, what about me? Worrying about their own situation going forward. And I think leadership that is providing good communication and a roadmap and explaining their decisions well is really important right now. So I would recommend that. And we're trying to support that as much as we can through forums and webinars.
Great, thanks, Kai. I'm going to jump into some audience questions pretty quickly here, but one last question, kind of coming back to the shorter term. We're seeing that Americans likely to enroll, there's a strong preference among these shorter term programs. Jeff, I'd be curious, maybe to start with you, but I think all three of you should certainly chime in here, but how are you seeing institutions right now? You kind of alluded to this in some of your early remarks, but how are you seeing institutions respond to this potential preference that folks are looking at shorter term programs? Are you seeing institutions already start to think about how they unbundle parts of their degree programs?
So I think we're already seeing this at the traditional undergraduate level around enrollment and retention. As Kai just mentioned, enrollment management is a big issue right now. And so what you're seeing by a number of schools, Oberlin, Rice, I know are doing this, so is my alma mater, where I also serve on the board of trustees at Ithaca College. So they're offering these short-term courses for incoming students that can be taken at a highly reduced rate. And then if you enroll, you get the credit for that. And the same thing for returning students, slightly different courses, but again, short courses, low price, and it's all connected to enrollment and retention. I don't think they've moved to where they think they need to go next is connections to the workforce. Clearly, lots of people unemployed, as we talked about earlier. There will be some jobs. There will be a lot of upskilling and reskilling. I'm just thinking of all the upskilling and reskilling that will need to be done in retail and hospitality, just around post-COVID regulations and other types of how we're going to live in this world, at least in the next couple of years. And so there's going to be a number of, and also the pivoting around other types of businesses that are going to go on. And so I can imagine a number of short courses that are directly tied to the jobs that are going to be needed in the next couple of years. And on that front, I don't think colleges and universities have started to think about how do we design short courses that connect directly to the workforce.
Mary Ellen, anything you'd want to add there from your experience?
Yeah, I think this is a transition that higher education has started to think about, and some had been more aggressive or progressive on it before this happened, but the universities that can pivot more quickly to being responsive to what their customers are calling for are going to be the ones who survive. This could be that moment of paradigm shift. There's been hinting about that in the data and the conversation here today. Last year, about the same time that we were able to announce the partnership with Microsoft on Future of Work, we also announced a bold plan in concert with higher education to quintuple our output of tech credentials and tech jobs every year in our community. We knew that that's where we needed to go, and that every job isn't going to be a data scientist or a coder, but every job is going to have tech components to it. And our university stood right along with us and said, yes, we know we need to change our offerings. We need to create new programs. It can't just all be a 5-year computer science engineering degree. But we all know universities don't turn on a dime historically. And so they've been challenged over the last year. We're getting ready to publish our first annual report on that effort we call Lou Tech Works. And this crisis that hit, I think, has really forced them to accelerate. I have to say, here in Louisville, the University of Louisville was right there in front of line, immediately posted free programming online, free courses that folks could take as part of this Future of Work initiative. And so folks are taking those today, and hopefully those folks will translate into paying students for the university at some point. And our community college has been a great partner on this IT journey as well for a couple of years. And not to focus entirely on IT, they've been also a great partner in our manufacturing space, where we have a lot of strength in our economy, and understanding that they needed to change their programming, their programs around apprenticeships and other skill building programs to meet what employers needed today. And so community colleges, to me, are going to be a place to watch. They should be a place that should be able to offer some of these short-term affordable credentials. Depending on the city or state you're in, they have been the best training partners for economic developers and job creators. It'll be fascinating to see what they do coming out of this.
Great. Wonderful. Let's jump into a few audience questions here. Actually, community colleges was one of the questions, so maybe we can stay on this thread for a little bit longer. Kai and Jeff in particular, you may have something to add on to what Mary Ellen said, but I think the question from one of our viewers is, what might we see community colleges attract some of the 4-year students who have canceled or changed their plans? Do we expect to see some of that enrollment shift at the community college level?
I'll take that quickly. Jenna and Kai, I'm sure, has more to add too. Yes, I think so. If you look at the survey, for example, that Sally May has done over the last couple of years about how Americans pay for college, we see that particularly among middle class families, the number of students going to community colleges has increased, and that's before before COVID-19. And so I only see a potential increase in that. If you think about the disruption that we've seen in the last couple of months, if parents and students aren't quite sure what this fall is going to look like, if it's going to be online anyway, they might say, you know what, if we're going to be online, we might as well go to a less expensive alternative that's closer to home. Maybe we could possibly take in-person classes at some of these community colleges. It still doesn't solve for what I think we need to solve for, because we know from the data that a large percentage, I think it's something like 80% of community college students go to community college intending to transfer, and it's something like 20% who end up transferring. Doesn't mean that without a 2-year degree you can't do anything, but then what ends up happening is that many of these students end up with 2-year degrees that don't have enough currency in the job market, and so it's not much better than having a high school diploma at that point. So this is where I think we need to work on, if we have students taking a 2-year route than rather a 4-year route, and they want to transfer, we have to make sure that happens. And if they just leave after 2 years, we have to make sure they leave with some sort of credential that actually carries currency in the job market.
Ditto to everything Jeff said. And no doubt the cost of higher education, it's prohibitive to many, and many folks have more debt than they should have. There are also many 18 and 19-year-olds who go away and for whatever reason have a suboptimal experience. They don't execute and do all that they need to do. I think community college is a great option for basically for everyone. And right now, you could argue, and we don't know this yet, that it would be better for new first-time, full-time freshmen to start online and get the learning figured out before they show up to a residential experience. Some people thrive in that, but not everybody does. And I think this does put, community colleges have sort of been on the map more, at least for the last 3 years ago, there was an 8-year period of a real focus on community colleges, and I think they're coming back again. And I think Jeff's absolutely right on the transfer pathways. And to Mary Ellen's comment earlier, colleges just struggle with disruptions to the business model. If you can see the lifetime value, tuition value of a student at X, call it $40,000 or $80,000 or $120,000 per student, it's very hard to let that go, but they have to. And this is a chance to start to do that. And so I think this will provide more opportunity, more of a catalyst for change than the 2007, 2008 recession did.
Great. Let's talk about the advice finding here. So question we have here is, do you have any advice for reaching families who have a limited variety of career examples within their own family or haven't attained a post-secondary education? Given that they are the ones, we've seen both that students are relying on families for their advice, and then we also know that those that do have a post-secondary education or some sort of post-secondary education are more likely to go back. So I think the question here is, for those families who we don't have that experience, how do we ensure that they're getting information about the educational opportunities available?
Obviously, that's something that we feel like is our job in Louisville, and what we do in Louisville Forward and in city government is to provide that type of information to folks. This upskilling initiative that we've rolled out and promoted repeatedly, we announced on the mayor's daily press conference about COVID-19. And so that has been amazingly popular, I might add. A lot of people tune in on Facebook Live to that, and the governor, I think, is going on across cities and states across the country. So those communication channels are perhaps more robust than they have been in a long time. And so there are probably programs going on in your communities like this. Maybe they just haven't gotten as much attention. So use the public officials' bully pulpits to talk about what the options are out there for folks. And then once we get back through this summer and into whatever public school and P-12 education looks like this fall, we've got to make sure that our education systems provide experiential learning, really starting as early as possible, definitely middle school forward. Our public school system a few years ago went to an academies model that's all built around letting these students have experiences early on. So every freshman gets in the workplace experiential learning, and then they kind of pick the path they think they want to follow for a potential career. And then they can get credentials and obviously college credit through their sophomore, junior, and senior years here. So having your public school system and your other P-12 providers providing a view into what a career could be like and understanding what that pathway could be like, and now knowing that the pathways are getting more interesting and more diverse, really, I think, puts some meat behind what we've been talking about for, a couple decades when we say college or career ready. Well, they're really only college or career ready if they've had an experience that shows them what they want to do and talk to somebody who actually does it every day. So I hope we can get back to that when we start to move more out of this pandemic.
I might just interject. Nicole and I have done a lot of research over the last couple of years looking at this issue of valued sources of advice and the ingredients that really change the value equation from a consumer education consumer or student perspective. And certainly 60% of those who graduate and complete a degree, post-secondary degree, say they're, in their own words, open-ended response, say the primary reason was a work outcome, right? They're looking for a job, a better job, a field they want to enter a career. And then when you look across those fields where people say, I got better value, there are those that are more closely linked to those work outcomes and fields. And the number one driver of all of that is the degree to which they rate the courses which they experience as relevant to what they do at work. So I think even more than ever, there's always the kind of transformation in education and expansion of horizons and seeing the world. But in this climate with the economic and financial pressures, that intensification of skills that I can put to work, I think we're really seeing through. And Nicole, you did some just beautiful analysis on those ingredients. Mary Ellen mentioned experiential learning,
Yep.
but there are some drivers also that change that perception for students.
Sure, and I think everything she said about having experiences that are relevant and applied is head on, and linking it back to advice. You know, one thing we found when we looked deeper into this was that people said that the most valuable advice they had gotten, so people who had already gone through it and were looking back, actually came from employers. So, you know, people are most likely to turn to family members because that's, you know, who they know and who they trust. But on the back end, people who had gotten advice from employers found that to be the most valuable. It's just not accessible to a lot of people. So people who haven't had those internships or there's work-based experiences have a real hole in knowing what they should be studying and what the pathway is to get there. They don't know, especially if they are the first in their family to go to college, what a pathway to a career that requires a college degree would look like, what they should even study and how they should get there. And so making those employer partnerships early, as you spoke to, Mary Ellen, is really important so that they have that network and they can have a mentor to ask when these questions come up. And, you know, that's true certainly for youth, but for adults as well who are seeking to make a career change. We have to do a better job of just partnering between those employers and higher ed so that people have better navigation to see how to get where they want to go.
And for students who say their career advising was excellent compared to poor, they're 10 to 12 percentage points more likely to say, my education was worth the cost, it makes me an attractive job candidate. And again, communities of color, lower income, first generation, they're the least likely to have access to those employer resources and the kind of visibility into the career. And so the emphasis there of, I think the principle we see in Mary Ellen's work is there's a clear connection between what I'm doing and the opportunity for me to apply and use that. And that gives people confidence to come in and work through that. So I just really appreciate this discussion, and it echoes back with this landscape of research we've been doing about the drivers of value in education and then now how they play out in this context.
I just want to quickly interject that we kind of mentioned internships a little bit here. As you can imagine, the world of internships has been massively disrupted. And it's again, a great moment or a time to reinvent the internship and to think, what are the core values and how are those delivered? I'm joined the board of a small healthcare focused nonprofit focused on employment pathways for academically strong, underserved students. And the funding, employers who are funding this and doing it, like 80% of them are out for the summer. And it's creating a little bit of a crisis. So I think that is going to be something that we need to think about this next year, helping employers continue with internships and finding a way to do it safely.
And that's actually, it's a good follow-up to a question we have, or a good prequel to a question we have from Louis Palacio. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. He's the executive director at Health and Science Innovations in Indianapolis. And so, Louis, you were making the point, you know, we have workforce development training programs to upskill adults, but government and philanthropic funding was dwindling pre-COVID. And now with COVID employers not being in a position, or COVID era employers not being in a position to host trainings and philanthropic dollars kind of shifting to addressing basic needs, we're having to cancel a lot of programs. So he's asking, you know, with the data showing that upskilling is of great interest, are there suggestions on new models to fund workforce development programs? Maybe Mary Ellen, you have some ideas there.
I'll start out by saying that the amount of money that we as a country invest in workforce development is ridiculously low. And when you think of the amount of money that we've been spending here out of Washington in the last few weeks, the appropriations versus what we spent on the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act, it's just way out of balance. And so if there are future stimulus packages, a CARES 2, COVID 4, whatever you want to call it, coming out of Congress, hopefully there can be investments through the WIOA pipeline. That is a stronger pipeline than it has been in the past since the reboot of that act and the board several years ago. Much more connected to business, much more connected to the supply and demand factors and workforce across the community. So I would say throwing a few $1 billion here and there at our WIBs would be a great idea at this point in time. And this is where the way this balance of this ecosystem works. When times are good, you've got private employers that want to put more money in because they need employees, right? Because you've got low unemployment. And now when times are not so good and employment's up, but the ability for the private sector to contribute is down, this is where government really needs to step up, and primarily at the federal level. So that's where the money is right now, to be able to invest, to pull us out of this economic crisis sooner rather than later. The amount of money that is invested in stimulus activities out of the federal government will draw a direct correlation to how soon we exit what will be a recession very soon.
Jenna, the thing that I want to mention too is that we also have to remember that in past recessions, or when there's been upheaval in the job market, even in local markets, that students who had not only the resources, or unemployed workers who had the resources but had the experience of post-secondary education always tend to fare better. And so one thing that I worry about this is that I think our traditional systems are built for those people who tend to be at the top of the market anyway. And what I would hope, as Kai mentioned, we need to rethink the internship. I think we also need to use this opportunity to rethink the education to pipeline, or the to the workforce pipeline, or even the workforce to the education to the workforce pipeline coming out of this. We had a lot of gig workers, obviously, that have lost their employment because of this, and they don't really have employers to go back to in many cases. And then we had other people who were working for employers who haven't been in college in any form or fashion for decades, even if they graduated from college. And so just to expect them to go back to even a community college and take a 2-year degree, I think is unrealistic in many cases without additional help. And so I think this would be a great time to kind of rethink that pathway as well.
Well, we've come to the top of our hour quickly, like always. We've got great questions here. As Dave mentioned, we download these every week and look through them and make sure that we're taking all of your feedback into account. So we really appreciate all of the input. I know there were a lot of questions around whether we'll have this recording of the webinar and the deck available. We will. That'll be up probably by tomorrow. strataeducation.org/public viewpoint is where you can find the last 8 weeks of data, and that's where we'll put the webinar recording and deck as well. Dave, anything else you want to share before we wrap up here?
Yes, certainly. Thanks, not just for your time today, but for the work you do every day, to each of you and all who've gathered. The other thing, Jeff made a note early about the swirl and things being in swirl and this summer being critical. Even in the last 5 weeks, 5 weeks ago, 64% of Americans said they were likely to enroll in something, work-based education one way or another. This week, that was 53%. So 11% fewer Americans saying, I'm going to look to education within the next 6 months than they were 5 weeks ago. So we're continuing to monitor that and these other pieces as we go through the summer. And we'll just maintain this dialogue with all of you. And thank you for engaging with us.
Wonderful. Well, we'll release our next round of data next week, and the week following we'll be back as part of our webinar series. So look forward to seeing you all then, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have any other questions. Jeff, Kai, Mary Ellen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.